It has been a long year from 2020 to 2021, but you've also accomplished a lot of things in Sacramento. What are the one or maybe two things that you would like to highlight specifically for folks on the Central Coast? And anybody can start first.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be somewhere in person. So that's a nice change. And I know there's a lot of Cal Poly people here, so I should say getting a big increase in the CSU and UC and K through 12 budget was a great thing this year. But a couple of things. One is and it's ironic because I got 10 bills to the governor's desk and he signed them all. But to me, some of the biggest things were in the budget. And our University of California Cooperative Ag Extension has been, no pun intended, dying on the vine. They've been cut by inflation for 15 or 20 years. And so I worked really hard to get a 55% increase and try to restore cooperative ag extension to where it was 15 or 20 years ago, which really makes a difference in the advice to farmers and 4-H clubs and different things on the ground in a very good way. And this happens, the 4 counties in the district, with the exception of the stressed ag industry that's left in Santa Clara County, has a really robust agricultural sector, so that was good. And the other one that I should mention, because I'm here, even though I'm in San Luis Obispo, is that Atascadero had loaned millions of dollars to start their redevelopment agency. And then when the state swept redevelopment, they didn't recognize those loans to pay them back. And so Atascadero was still owed $3 million from the state, and it was never paid back. And, you know, they were been trying. And so I actually introduced a bill that would recognize the loans and allow them to be reimbursed the $3 million. And I'm moving this bill very successfully, and I get it over to the Assembly, and I give Jordan a heads up that it's coming. And the governor's office calls and says, we're worried about the precedent. What if you could find something for $3 million that would help Atascadero? And so Atascadero in the budget this year got $3 million for a fire station. And it makes good the debt that they had been worrying about for 8 years and getting back to their general fund. I'm really proud of being able to help them do that.
A lot of the accomplishments as well are also possible because both of you are working together among many other issues. What about you, Assemblyman Cunningham?
Yeah, I'll start with the budget too. We're seeing more stuff get done in the budget process, I think, than when I first got elected in 2016. Couple things I think of long-run significance to the state is a major investment in broadband infrastructure to the tune of like $6 billion, which is a really good start. Connecting rural places, getting what they call middle mile, connecting we've got a pretty good setup in terms of the initial infrastructure, but then you got to connect it. I don't know the technical terms, so forgive me, but you got to use a middle mile to connect it to the hub in the community, and then last mile gets it into the home. And as we did a basically year-long experiment with kids doing remote schooling, mostly from home on tablets, we learned that our broadband infrastructure in California just simply was not adequate. So I think this $6 billion is a big win. I've been working on career technical education since I got elected in 2016, getting designated state money for a grant program that could be matched to local dollars to fund career technical education, both hiring teachers, investing in the classrooms. It's one thing to put desks in a room with a chalkboard or a whiteboard. It's a whole other thing to buy welding hoods and then get a certificated welding instructor, right? These are difficult things. But if you look at the demand in the job market, I mean, a starting welder today makes about $90,000 or $100,000 starting with a certification you can get in 18 months. Plumbers are up to 80. I mean, and we're building more than we've built in a long time. So the time to invest in that's now. So we've been able to kind of keep the commitment in the budget to that state career technical ed program. Me and Assemblymember O'Donnell, who chairs the ed committee, have been working on that together for 5 years now. So in terms of bills, our offshore wind power bill, AB 525, that sets for the first time in state law, or requires the PUC technically to set in state law specific targets for offshore wind power development, which is a big deal, because if you haven't read about it, the first place the federal government has opened for leasing to develop offshore wind power on the West Coast is off the coast of Morro Bay. So we've got hookups right into the power grid through Diablo and through the old PG&E substation at Morro Bay. So we've got the infrastructure, we've got the lease space that the feds have cleared, and now this bill gives us a target so the state can get part of that federal money. The administration right now federally is talking about $30 billion of offshore wind power development. I want some of that to come here. It doesn't all need to go on the West Coast or East Coast, and we need the power. I mean, we desperately need the power, and we'll get into that later, but our energy grid is in for a world of hurt over the next 5 to 10 years as we start to see things like Diablo Canyon go through decommissioning. So I'm very proud of, and he was very helpful in the Senate, I should say too. You know, that was a very cool bicameral partnership we were able to do there.
Yeah, and since you mentioned the bill that both of you actually moved forward and co-authored, is as far as the offshore wind project, do you foresee any roadblocks to that as you try to move that project forward?
It's building something. There's roadblocks all over.
We're California.
We do roadblocks really well.
And Jordan and I were just talking about it, but I went to the Glasgow conference on climate, and one of the great things was with a few members of the Assembly, I took a day trip, a 6-hour round trip by train, and then got on a boat and went out into the North Sea and saw their floating wind turbines. And it was really powerful because I gotta confess, I could never quite get this floating thing. And there it is 60 meters, and you know, we were dealing with meters over there. It was 60 meters, and it's 600 meters here. And yet they have a substructure under the water that allows the weight of the water to stabilize these huge things. And they have cords that go down to the base, and they're talking about having so many here that they might need a electrical substation on the floor of the ocean where these are to then come in to what hopefully is one of these two hookups where the grid already reaches heavily into San Luis Obispo County. And it was really helpful. I assessed, having witnessed my share of environmental disputes over the years, that there's a couple of issues, and one is there's already an issue of whales and sea life out there. I think that'll be able to be mitigated, and the birds, because it's far enough out that it's not with the intensity that there have been bird strikes on land turbines. And secondly, there'll have to be a little disturbance on the ocean floor for the cords to bring the power in. They're going to trench, but as it is now, there are trenches off this coast for certain fiber optic cables and other things. This is not a new thing. It seemed to me when I was looking at the list of things, those were the two that I could see getting a little life, but I think we can overcome them.
Since we're talking about energy, Diablo Canyon also, you've mentioned that. The fate of it right now, it looks like it's still up in the air, although, including Assemblyman Cunningham, you've been vocal in maybe we should re-examine if it should be extended and operations-wise. So what is happening right now with Diablo Canyon, and what can people expect in terms of energy, and how can we cushion the effect of it being decommissioned in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I'll start with that. And it's interesting because right now we saw last summer a rolling brownout period, right? If you look at the grid and you look at the curves, the peak demand's now the first 2 hours after the sun goes down. That is not peak supply in California because solar goes to zero and wind dies down, so your wind production goes down. We've done a great job as a state building renewables. We've got lots of wind and lots of solar, lots of geothermal, lots of renewable power. What we haven't kept up with is building storage, whether it's battery, gravitational, pump storage, things of that nature. So the surplus power that we're producing when the sun's shining doesn't get exported. So we could keep that, store it in lithium battery or what have you, and then run the switch the other way at night and power people's homes when they get home from work, flip on 17 screens and 15 tablets and run their air conditioning, right? And charge their car, right? So, I mean, that's the new world. We need more electrons than we're producing today, and we barely produce enough today. So we're in a bit of a bind. I mean, I think the Morro Bay lithium battery storage project excites me. I think that's important. It'd be the biggest one on the West Coast if they build it out to the capacity they want. I think you got to couple renewable with more storage for it to really work. And I think there's sort of, MIT and Stanford released a study, was not funded by any vested interest. They were looking at what would be the benefits of running Diablo another 10 years through to 2035, and found, under their estimation, $2.1 billion in cost savings and a 10% reduction in carbon emissions. So I think it's something at least worth having a conversation about, but really it will really probably take the governor, agreeing to go along with that. I read today in the paper, our Energy Secretary Granholm has publicly said we need to revisit this issue. Obviously, the job benefit's tremendous for us here, right? The energy benefit's tremendous. But as it stands now, status quo, PG&E owns the asset. They would have to sell it or sell the license and sell the asset. Somebody else would have to be willing to run it, or PG&E would have to be willing to keep it. There's a lot of things that would have to change. So we need to prepare for the likely reality that we do go through decommissioning. Senator Monning and I, who've done the State of States when he was in Senator Laird's seat, we worked together in 2018 on SB 1090 to get economic mitigation funds for the community. I tell you what, I'm probably as proud of that as anything I will ever work on. And we got that thing through 7 committees in 2 houses, unchanged, which is very unusual for a bill to not be modified and then and amended throughout the process and watered down. Got it to the governor, and we did not know until the governor's office called us whether he was going to sign it. I mean, we were expecting the worst. But that was a big deal for our community because we can keep the workforce. The bill funded the workforce retention grants that allowed us to keep the workforce, because shock of shocks, if you announce X number of years out, you're going to close a nuclear power plant, other states start stealing all of your employees because these are highly trained people that have security clearances and all sorts of things. You can't just find them on the street. And so, if you fall below the threshold the NRC sets, they yank your license. Like you gotta shut the plant off. So we've staved off that. We've built, I think, a basis for the economic mitigation. Whether the governor and the state and the policymakers, the key ones, decide the State Lands Commission's a big deal. You got to get a new license for the intake of seawater for cooling. Whether they decide to revisit it or not, I don't really know. But I think I've sat on Utilities and Energy Committee now for 4 of my 5 years in the legislature, and I've done countless oversight hearings with the PUC, CAISO, you name it. If there's a plan out there to get to our emissions targets, a real concrete A to B to C plan, I have not seen it. I'll just say that. I'm not sure it exists. So we may have to get a little more creative.
It's so tempting to just talk about this the rest of the time, because Senator Monning asked me to contact the people in the governor's office when I was working for the governor about that bill. And I weighed in, and I came away and told them, I have no idea what they're going to do. I can't tell. They were not tipping their hand in any way. And we have this amazing opportunity on the coast because the Morro Bay battery storage will be the biggest when it's built, surpassing what's at Moss Landing now. And in each case, Moss Landing and Morro Bay, they were fossil fuel plants that have been converted to battery storage, and then you can use the transmission that exists there, and it has been a great thing. And the Diablo Canyon, one of the hardest things, with all due respect to the Cal Poly people in the room, one of the hardest things sometimes when you're in elected office is when somebody releases an academic study that talks about it as a high level and does not address the realities of the situation. And so the fact that you might have to give $500 million to PG&E to keep the plant going, and the fact that you might have to pay back however much of that 400 million was dispersed by the state for a transition that now isn't happening, just wasn't mentioned in the study. And so I sort of go with the statement that Jordan made at the end, that we have to be ready because it seems like it's headed that way. And the other thing, just to say that of interest, because Jordan said, you know, the goals and how we're going to meet them aren't clear. I remember when I was on the city council in Jurassic times, I think it was 32 years ago, the state passed a bill that said, we're going to divert 50% from the landfills in 10 years. And I thought, what a great goal. It'll never happen, you know, and there's nothing underneath it. Well, until the pandemic, we diverted 60%, and our next goal was 75. And the fact that we had the goal made us figure out the different ways to do it. And when I was in the Assembly in 2006, we passed AB 32. And when the federal government walked away from the International Kyoto Accords, we passed them and we put them on California. We said we are going to have the emissions in 2020 that we had in 1990. And that would be anywhere, depending on how you calculate it, like 11 or 13% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions. And everybody said, that's just a goal. You're just giving them powers. You'll never do it. Well, we met it 4 years early. And while we were having the 5th largest economy in the world. So it was not taking away from jobs. And so as painful as it is to set these goals, and now the governor does it all the time in executive orders, sets out these goals and you have no idea what's underneath it. And the good news is it gives us the running room to decide what to do to meet it. The bad news is there's nothing underneath it when he does it. And so I think we have done the easier parts of the goals. They weren't easy, but the easier parts of the goals. And now here come the harder parts, which is the moving more into the transportation sector and trying to figure out how to get emissions out of it and some of the others, and how to do that where there's equity. It's not just wealthy people driving the electric cars, and how to make sure there's an infrastructure that supports it the same way we're talking about the infrastructure that's going to support the other changes. And believe it or not, that was the brief version.
And we could talk about Diablo Canyon for hours and never run out of issues to talk about. But one of the things that's in the facility is a desalination plant. And right now, where California and much of Western U.S. is facing extreme drought, do you feel that with all the resources that we have, we're effectively managing our water resources?
That sounds like a perfect question for the former Secretary of Natural Resources. And then I can copy his answer.
Yeah, and I would have to say no, but the thing about it is there's a real underlying problem. Everybody always thinks there's much more water out there, and if we just changed our policies, we would grab all this additional water. It is true with recycling. It is true to the extent you do desal. It's true to the extent people conserve more, but it's not really true with regard to the water that's in our rivers and streams. That's very finite. And it's not really true with underground water, which has not been sustainably managed, and in some areas of the state is critical, and in the San Joaquin Valley, where we have had substantial subsidence, and that is not something that comes back after you do it. It's not like it's a balloon where the air goes out and you blow it back up. And so we now have this problem of canals and rivers, bridges over rivers and roads that are sinking, and so we have infrastructure problems as well as water. And so the question is what we did was an all of the above strategy. And when we negotiated the water bond in 2014, we said that there would be pots of money for water recycling, for storage, for other things, and we would only put money toward it if you could prove that it could produce water or water gains from each one of those. It wasn't a collection of earmarks. It was actually based on the merit. How do you produce water? And there's been a little stepping back from that, but that's where we need to go. And this year, we're where we are in the second year of this drought, where we were at the end of the fourth year of the drought that was earlier in the last decade. And so I got a package in the budget that got moved to next year for Central Coast water resiliency, because except for a few places in San Luis Obispo and a few places in Santa Clara County, my entire Senate district does not import water. You have to live on what you get in dams or recycling or what you create. And we need extra help here. And so when we go back in January, I'm going to try to move that up to an early action, because there are just various places where that would make a big difference.
You mentioned Assemblyman Cunningham. Do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say, if they had not, I was not there at the time, but if they had not done the Prop 1 water bond and it had not been passed by the voters, we'd be in a world of hurt right now with this drought. And I've seen that firsthand. I mean, we helped Paso Robles City, San Luis Obispo City, Pismo, and the Templeton Community Services District all get wastewater treatment plant funding through the Prop 1 water bond. And I went and toured, it's probably been 2 years now, the Paso facility. And that is contributing immensely to Paso's water issues. And I live in Paso Robles, and it's just a constant fight between grape growers and residents there with the groundwater, just constant fight, litigation, you name it. And that facility has been phenomenal. So we need more of that. We need a lot more of it. I like desalination, and I like the idea of, if Diablos gets decommissioned, they've got a desalination plant there that is pretty large, and there was a plan in place that's mothballed somewhere in the county, but before the closure of Diablo was announced back in 2016, the county entered an agreement with PG&E to buy the surplus water that they don't need for the plant operation. And I think they were going to pipe it 7 miles to Lopez Lake, and you could recharge the aquifers at Lopez. I mean, we may be in a position where we got to look at that again. Maybe that's something that could be a partial use of the Diablo facility, because it's very difficult. The senator mentioned rightly that you got academic stuff up here, but then you got political realities, you got monetary realities. I mean, some of these plans are hard to implement. It's very difficult to get a desalination plant built in California. The one in Carlsbad, is it Carlsbad? Yeah, I think it's Carlsbad. It was $1.2 billion, and it took them 10 years to get through CEQA and get all the lawsuits settled. And they wanted it. Poseidon really was like, hey, we're all in on this. We're going to pay what it takes to get this thing built. That's a 10-year plan, and it was $1.2 billion. A good portion of that was litigation costs. So I don't know if that's a feasible way out necessarily of the next drought, but where we do have plants that are working, maybe we can repurpose them.
And just one comment on that. Desal is the most energy intensive of any water sources now. And it might change a little as we get more to renewables and that. But San Diego was able to do it, or the area water district that Carlsbad is in, because they could bury it in all these other water sources that cost less, and the ratepayers could absorb the cost. So if it was 10% of the total water, just everything else made it affordable. If you're in a smaller jurisdiction, it is really hard to bury the rates. It is really higher per capita. And that's the challenge for the Central Coast, because there's not that high concentration of ratepayers that will really carry a project like that.
And one of the issues that California is also facing, the increasing frequency of wildfires has also become more destructive over the years. What plan is in the works right now to address how fast we're moving in terms of all the damage and how homes and businesses lost because of the frequency and intensity of these wildfires?
I'm sorry that there's all these resources questions. Yeah, because I had CAL FIRE for 8 years. And the thing, it's a good question. And this year I did a bill because the only thing we would do for fire prevention, such as prescribed fire, controlled burns, fuels management in certain areas, or forest management, was whatever we put in the budget in a year. And so we didn't have goals that were sort of statutory or met. So I did a bill that basically said, we will now have a 5-year plan with goals. It will be adaptively managed. And this year, the press had to beat out of the administration how many acres had been treated in one place, and now there'll be a transparent process so that in real time, you'll know exactly what's being treated. So that was important because now there'll be a 5-year plan and you know what our goals are. But I think the real thing is we're not doing enough. And so that will become really evident as we sort of lay this out and we match what has happened. And the other part of your question is what we do afterwards is really, you know, St. Louis Obispo County dodged the bullet the last couple of years. The northern part of the district did not. And I always felt totally lazy living in a city of 50,000 next to the ocean that has fog and is in a temperate climate. It never occurred to me I would have to pack and be ready to go. And I was a year ago, August. It came right up to the edge of the city, and we just had our fire department at the city limits, one big wind, and it was in. And so there is the other issue of resources on the firefighting side. And when we went to taking a lot of prisoners back to realignment to counties, now sheriffs control some of those inmate firefighters where the state didn't. But we have to beef up the Conservation Corps. We have to beef up the firefighting force. And we always said there was this distinct fire season. Well, that doesn't exist anymore. And we were built around the way that firefighters can fight as temporaries for 6 months, and none of them are staying 6 months anymore. It's blowing up the personnel system. And so we just have a lot of work to do across the board.
And of course, an issue that I think we can all agree as Californians are one of the biggest issues among others is housing and homelessness. And both of you have moved forward bills in a state legislature that would address both of these problems, including SB 9, SB 10. Can you talk a little bit more about the approach that we hope to see here in San Luis Obispo County, first to address the housing issue?
Yeah, sure. Let me just touch on the fire issue just briefly. I do think we've made some progress. In 2017, we negotiated some money out of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, the quote-unquote cap and trade dollars for fire prevention and healthy forest management. As the senator alluded to, the problem we've always had is that's a one-off, one-year thing, and then we're back hoping for a budget surplus asked to do it again. So I think we're addressing that and taking a more 5-year scope like he's talking about. That's positive. We need more personnel. That's an important thing. We have, there's a lot of places where PG&E owns power lines that run through forests, and I mean the branches are just on the lines where undergrounding or insulating, what they call hardening in the utilities world, PG&E is actually spending more money on hardening than they've ever spent in the history of the company. That's a positive thing. And now we're doing power safety power shutoffs, public safety power shutoffs, PSPS, which my constituents love. Every time PG&E does one of those sons of guns, my office is flooded with complaints. I send them right to PG&E. Go ahead. Yeah, let them know, those jerks. But it is an important tool that we didn't really have and we didn't use even 4 or 5 years ago. At least it wasn't used much. So there's some progress being made, but a lot more needs to be invested. Housing.
And you don't have my spouse in your district, or you really would have heard complaints.
Hate to be in your house.
Yeah, we were out for 3 days.
It's brutal. It's a tough deal. The housing issue, we have, I think, when I took office, it was estimated that our housing shortage on a unit basis in California was 2 million units. And I read a study the other day that it's now 3 million units. And I'm like, wait a minute, we're building more housing than we've ever built. It's like, what? We're going backwards. But my point is, we have a massive imbalance between supply and demand of housing. And if you've seen the pricing, especially in this area, you know that. I mean, you understand that. And it's having a generational impact. I mean, we're seeing retirees move to cheaper states. We're seeing young folks that maybe grew up here and would love to come back, not able to do that. And that's a bummer. And I think we have to build more. I mean, there's no way around that. We have to be smarter. In places where it makes sense, we need more density. am wary personally because I've seen over the years with housing, some legislator that's maybe from Los Angeles, just to pick a random place, or San Francisco, maybe to pick another random place, has a brilliant idea that would work really well in an urban environment, and they want to make a state law and put it on San Luis Obispo County and Santa Barbara County and Tiama County and everywhere, right? One size fits all, thou shalt do it this way. And I think we've gotten a little better about giving a little more, I don't say local control, because you've got some capture there sometimes, right? I think there needs to be a mechanism where it's really not rational or legitimate when a local government has just blocked housing because that's what their constituents are yelling about, right? Not my backyard, I got my castle, you know, put the drawbridge up, right? But you do need a mechanism, I think, for the state to come in that circumstance. But you also want to give local governments the flexibility and control over sort of their own decisions because, you know, look, they tend to know where and how things will work out best. So I think SB 9, which I was happy to support, was a good balance in that regard. Some of the other housing bills haven't been as balanced. But I mean, we've got $1 trillion problem with housing. I don't think that's, I mean, I'm making a number up, but that's probably not that far off. I mean, we've just got a lot of building that has to happen all over the place.
Senator Laird, anything to add about that?
Yes, I'm kind of amused because one of the other times I've been in this very room was for a housing summit where a senator from San Francisco was sitting right where we are. Amazing.
I love him, by the way.
Yeah.
Senator Whittier's a great dude.
It's interesting because it's tough. It's a continuum of the issues. And so what Jordan just described were the zoning bills that were this year. And I did a similar thing. I voted for SB 9, but I didn't vote for SB 10. And that was the Wiener bill. And that was really unique in the Senate. There were only 8 no votes. And the thing about it is there was a thing in that bill that said a 2/3 vote of a city council or board of supervisors could override a citizen-approved ballot measure, and that was just a bridge too far for me. And the interesting thing is if you look at the breadth of the Senate district, there's 21 cities in the Senate district, and I think on that bill, 1 mayor supported it and 20 mayors opposed it. And it was really the mayor of the city of 1 million people who thought we have the density, we have the ability to do this, and the mayors of cities that were under 60,000 on down that were like, no, this overrides us when we have, in Monterey, there's a de facto water moratorium. In Santa Cruz, there's 5,000 units at the university that don't count in the housing allocation. There's all these local issues that sort of shade the issue. But the bills that we're talking about were on the process, and then there was a humongous slug of money related to homelessness and trying to make a difference there. And in the middle, for the actual construction of affordable housing, we have some leftover bond money, but we use these mechanisms for density bonuses or inclusionary that provide something, but we don't really provide help for nonprofit housing developers or cities and counties, particularly since redevelopment left, to support financially affordable housing, and it needs a financial assistance to make these projects go, because overwhelmingly the housing that's being built is market rate, and that is not the housing that the people that Jordan was talking about that are struggling can afford. And so this year, my predilection for some of the budget surplus, which I know you're going to get to, maybe not at the rate we're going, but that the budget surplus, we need to put some in affordable housing, because otherwise it comes from grants, or bonds, where you're paying interest at $1.40 to $1.90 on the dollar that goes to housing. And if we have a surplus, it's one time when we put it in it, we get a dollar for dollar benefit. The only problem we have right now is the building trades really want these projects to have prevailing wage. and they blow them up for the nonprofit providers. We have to negotiate a solution to that to be able to spend the money, but that's where we need to focus some effort in the next session.
Right, and really quick, I know we have Project Homekey in Paso Robles, which at the 6-month mark, we checked in with them and it looked like it's been successful so far. Do you hope to see that model anywhere else within the Central Coast? Is that something that could be possibly implemented in other cities or areas?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, I mean, it's a good example of the type of partnership and the type of collaboration we want to have. And there's a lot of money in the budget for that. So, I mean, a lot, maybe not relative to the size of the problem, but a lot in real dollar terms.
And I think the thing that is on the edge of thermonuclear, it all comes back to nuclear, but the thing that's on the edge of thermonuclear is that when some cities do their parts and others don't, it sort of moves the problem around in a not helpful way. In here, there's 40 Prado, and there's ECHO, and now there's Project Homekey and a second ECHO facility in Paso Robles. It's really important that it be done in different places so that problem is addressed everywhere and isn't moved around.
And one thing that we cannot deny is we are still in the middle of a pandemic, which complicates things a lot more than it should. And just last month, the emergency proclamations have been extended for at least March of next year. And can you give us a little bit of an insight on the politics side and how does that emergency proclamation, emergency powers work? Who decides when it's extended? Who can tell us when it ends? And also, how does that change the dynamic between Sacramento and the local public health officials and statewide as well?
Sure, I can give you quick answers to that. The governor, the governor, the governor. The governor decides when it starts, okay? Governor decides how long it goes. Governor decides when it ends. That's the current Emergency Services Act. It's been challenged in court. There was a lawsuit brought that said, hey, the governor has emergency powers under the ESA, but can't make law, can't substantively alter law. That lawsuit got overturned on appeal. There have been a number of bills introduced. In Michigan, what they did is they put a time limit on it. If there's a declared state of emergency after a certain number of days, it would have to come back to the legislative branch, and the legislative branch would have to reauthorize or validate or ratify, I guess is the word, that the emergency is still ongoing, and then the governor could go on and exercise the emergency powers from there. We don't have that in California. I introduced a bill modeled on Michigan because I got so frustrated with this last year. AB 109, for anybody nerd, if you want to go see a dead bill. It didn't get a hearing. There's no grave there or anything, just a rest in peace. But I did it to make a statement. I have concerns. It's got nothing really to do. I shouldn't say that. That's not accurate. It does have something to do with the way the current governors operated under the Emergency Services Act, but really to me there's just sort of fundamental separation of powers, balance of powers, co-equal branch of government issues, and I think when the governor has the ability to say change workers' comp law that affects every employer and every employee in the state. Normally workers' comp stuff, you go through 9 months of legislative process, 8.5 months, sometimes over 2 years, sometimes 16 months, with experts weighing in and policy committees, and you're trying to figure out where do we strike the right balance, how is the system going to work? I mean, that's our democratic process, and whether you like the law or not at the end of the day, that's a democratically enacted law, and if the governor signs it, that's the law, and you live with it and you move on, right? I don't think it's a good thing long-term for any governor to be changing law or changing things like the workers' comp system with an executive order. And I would say, by the way, I have the same issue with presidents of the United States doing it. Okay, on both sides, both Trump and Biden and Obama and W. To me, we are in a realm that's unprecedented, and we're in a crisis that's unprecedented, and a pandemic that's unprecedented. So you want to have an executive that can act swiftly and move things around and issue orders like that. You don't have time for the legislature to go through a lot of the process for some of the emergency stuff. But when you get into the realm, in my view, of actually just changing policy that doesn't need to change in any immediate way to deal with the emergency, you got a bit of a constitutional balance issue. That's my view. The senator probably has a different view.
It's not as far from you as you might think, but two comments on it. And the first is I think one of the most unreported stories this year was how we did the budget in the spring. And normally, I was budget chair for most of my run in the state assembly, and we have this conference committee. So the Senate does a budget, the Assembly does a budget. Wherever they disagree, you have a conference committee that integrates it into one budget. And that conference committee, when I chaired it, had 500 agenda items. And this year, the decision was made, the Senate's going to negotiate with the Assembly, and we're going to present a complete public budget that hasn't been negotiated with the governor and give it to him. And that's what we did. And the contours were really interesting because we put half the money, the equivalent of half the money of the surplus in reserves, and the other half either helping people really in need or dealing with intractable problems, childcare, broadband, homelessness, lowering the Medicaid age to 50, things like that. So and the governor, when it was out in public, felt like he had no option in the end but to sign those things. When we did the education increases and paid off the deferrals to K through 12, he didn't want to pay off the deferrals, but when we had it budgeted to do that, he felt obligated to sign it. But the second half of the thing that might be where we differ a little is the state of emergency has really been around the pandemic, and the pandemic has never been the same. And so I had this weird situation where we come into session the first week of January. I have been appointed chair of the Education Budget Subcommittee. The governor proposes a $6.4 billion package to reopen schools. And I'm immediately at the table for the Senate negotiating this. And when he proposed it about January 1st, we had a color system then. We were in deep purple everywhere. He was proposing reopening schools where the pandemic was really extreme. And we didn't want to do that. And a lot of parents didn't want to do that. And by the time we came to an agreement in the middle of February, the pandemic had changed. Everybody was much more open to opening the schools at the lower grades on a limited level. We figured out that the money wasn't to force people to open, but to enable them to do what they had to do to spend to make it happen. And then we thought, okay, in May, this is good. Everything's going to reopen. And then there's a surge, and so we offer an alternative to reopening. And it's been difficult to press for a complete revocation of the emergency order because the emergency has been changing as we go along, and the governor has needed the powers to deal with it as it's happened. And that, I believe in the balance of powers, but I also believe in the ability to act quickly in really dangerous and difficult circumstances.
And since we're talking about the governor, California had its second recall election in state history just a couple of months ago. For what we saw as a result, what does that say to you about California voters, how they're voting, and what are the implications for both parties, Republican and Democratic Party?
I don't know if recalls are weird. They just kind of are strange beasts. I mean, he performed better than you would have thought given his approval rating polling. And I think there's a good chunk of people that are like, there's another election in a year. I'm not super thrilled about how things are going maybe, but let's give them a year and see how things go, right? I mean, I have a lot of friends that are on Democratic voters that sort of express that to me. And I don't know that the recall necessarily is very predictive, for example, what's going to happen in next year's election. Like I think obviously there's a Democrat structural advantage in California politics statewide. That's pretty evident. If you observe politics in California or look at party registration numbers or whatever data point you want, that's just obvious. And it's probably on the nature of 14 to 16 points statewide, but that's 14 to 16 points in a state of 40 million people is a lot of votes, right? So I'm sort of, my view on the recall is the voters had their chance to speak their mind. I do think the process, some view it as a giant waste of time and money. I'm not in that camp. I think we got some movement on certain things like school reopening and small business reopening that I don't think we would have gotten, or at least not in the way or as quickly as we did without the recall process. But yeah, I think you'd be a fool to bet against Newsom next year. That's probably about as predictive as I want to get with it.
Senator Laird?
I think if you could maybe do political analysis and step back from what parties we happen to be in. Gavin Newsom wasn't doing so well when he was the only candidate in the race and it was all about him. And the minute Larry Elder became what appeared to be the alternative, and in one particular moment on the Democratic side, when he said that if Dianne Feinstein left her seat early, he would appoint a Republican and flip the balance of the United States Senate, that brought all these Democrats home that wouldn't have come home absent that. And I think that's what really made the difference for Gavin Newsom. He might have been in the mid-50s if he was just running on approval ratings, but he got whatever it was, 60 or 61% when that happened.
I agree with that.
And we mentioned, you briefly touched on it already, the record surpluses that we're seeing in the state. Do you feel that the money is being used effectively? And if you could move it around, which areas will you put more money on or maybe take a little bit less of?
I don't sit on budget committee, so I could give you my wish list with no consequence and no real ability to influence it, by the way. I think you got water infrastructure is still really important. I'd like to see resources allocated there. Fire prevention is still really important. I'd like to see resources allocated there. I think there's a sneaky little thing that's really important to all of our businesses that's not being talked about much, and that is that during the pandemic, we borrowed from the Federal Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund at rates that far exceed any borrowing any state in the history of this trust fund has ever done because of our size, right? And far exceeded what we did in the Great Recession even. And the way that works, as it's been explained to me by experts that I'm assuming were correct, is you borrow that money, you owe that money. You've got to pay that back to the federal government, and there are automatic scheduled, effectively tax increases on a per employee basis that get handed down to every business that helps the state repay that. And the numbers are looking at if we don't do anything to allocate some of the surplus now to pay that debt down a little earlier, we're on a schedule where it goes from like $42 an employee right now to potentially $400 an employee. So, and it took us 9 years to pay that debt off after the Great Recession. We didn't pay it off till 2019. So that's a giant sneaky tax increase on every small business, and it hits the labor-intensive businesses the hardest, our tourism industry, our restaurants, and the businesses that are barely hanging on. You know, some of these places without PPP loans would be gone for good, right? So that's an important thing that I'd like to see some of the surplus used for, so we pay some of that debt to the Federal Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund early, so we don't end up with really, really onerous tax increases on small business. And you know, I always say theoretically it'd be great to like have a gas tax holiday or something, but it's not going to happen. I mean, it's just not going to happen in California. So, you know, some middle class or working class tax relief would be awesome. But you know, I think in the realm of feasible, water, fire, pay down some of this debt so we don't have a ticking time bomb for our small businesses.
And just to follow up on one of those things, on the unemployment one way to do it would be give the rate holiday to the businesses and pay the difference directly and use the money to handle it that way. And I listed all these things that were done, and I left out student aid. I might have left out child care. But the thing about it is there was this important distinction. Half of it was one time and into reserves, and half was in more ongoing. And I think as you're asking about this last year, and the question you asked is always a deadly one for us, because is it being spent effectively? It takes so long to get some of these up that it's crazy making. You have the budget hearing in January, February, and you don't have adequate statistics yet to know whether the last year has been effective as you're having to start to make the decisions for the next year. And now we have 51 billion that is projected to be above projections for this next year's budget starting July 1st. 20 billion would go directly into Prop 98 or K through 14 schools. And half of that would be roughly one time, half would be ongoing. And then you have the other 31 billion. And in my view, it has to go overwhelmingly, if not totally, for one-time things. I mean, we're not in a position to build that in. And then the question is it fire? Is it water? Could you do that with the housing? Are there ways to pay off some of these things? The governor has floated the idea of paying down pension debt. And so the question is where are the one-time things? And President Armstrong is sitting here thinking, I have a one-time building construction project that is ready, and that's where we should be putting it. This is a time that if you have housing shortage, put the money in the construction of housing at the universities. It's a one-time expenditure. It meets a need. It's not ongoing, and so we're going to. And there's this. You know, you said you were a wonk. We're going to hit the gammon limit again and go over. And it was a thing the voters adopted in the late 70s that if it goes over, the revenues go over a certain amount, has to go half to schools or maybe half given back. But if you put it in infrastructure, it's exempt. And so we're going to face all this thing about how to apply that or deal with that in this budget. And I think schools and infrastructure could benefit there.
Yeah, and we do have a lot of questions, interesting questions due from our audience members. And the first one we're doing right now in the middle of the process of is state redistricting. Is there any hope that SLO County will get to stick together? And do you think that the state redistricting process should be changed?
Well, the map is supposed to be released tomorrow for the Central Coast area for the Assembly. The congressional maps are going to be in a couple weeks, I believe. The state Senate maps, they're doing it last, I guess, by district size is the thinking. So we'll find out. I mean, there have been a lot of public comments. My chief of staff has been monitoring the public comments, and we're making our voice heard in SLO County and Santa Barbara County. He said we dominated the public comment. This district I represent, the 35th, which is all SLO County, northern Santa Barbara County down to Lompoc, has been essentially the same geographic configuration going back to 2000 at least. And I'd say it's working pretty well. I mean, it's a good community of interest. We've got high schools that play sports against each other. People travel across the bridge for work. And it's an economic region, right? I mean, so I think the argument's very strong. The draft maps don't do that. They take sort of 2/3 of SLO, put it with kind of the coastal half of Monterey, and they go up and slice his county, a little piece of his county off in Santa Cruz. So creating a coastal region, which they call the mid-coast, which nobody's ever said. So I don't know where they got that. So, I mean, we'll see. We'll see tomorrow. I mean, the Citizens Redistricting Commission was instituted by the voters, approved overwhelmingly in an initiative. The alternative and the way it was done from time immemorial, before that was the legislature drew the seats. You got conflict of interest issues with that. The commission's sort of the worst way to do it other than all the other ways. You know, it's like what they say about democracy, right? Maybe judges end up doing it, but I don't know how they know how to do it any better. So, you know, we shall see where it ends up.
We keep getting admonished not to speak on it. And having said that, it's like the assembly districts that Jordan were talking about. It would take Santa Cruz County, which is the smallest landmass county except the county of San Francisco, and split it into 3 assembly districts. I mean, it just makes no sense. That was my assembly district, you know, 15 years ago. It's a community of interest around the Monterey Bay. It doesn't make any sense to split it up. And the first week that they did Senate maps, they didn't have me living in my own district, which gave me a complete heart attack. I did not see that coming. And then it sort of asserted itself. So now it is roughly the existing district with a couple of exceptions, and it flips part of the city of San Jose, and it cuts out the far south of San Luis Obispo County. And even though I'm not supposed to say anything and not have an interest, I would love to have all of San Luis Obispo County. I'd love to have it not split in any way.
And one of the things that we mentioned earlier is the offshore wind project. And a question came in, to really capitalize on wind energy, we will need a specialized wind port. Is that likely to materialize in SLO County?
Well, the senator and I have been working on getting some funds for a feasibility study for a deep water port. And that's, I think, step one. They're doing that in Humboldt, and they've got some state funds for that. I think that'd be good because we could lay the groundwork and study really how feasible it is. In terms of actually, let's say that comes back and says, yeah, you want to capture, I think it's very clear from the studies that have been done, if you want to capture 100% of the economic benefit of building offshore wind, you want to assemble as much of it as possible on site, which means you're barging in on giant barges, these giant pieces of equipment to stand up a 700-foot tall turbine with giant blades, right? So you need a deep water port to do that. So now funding the building of that is probably going to be a federal infrastructure thing because the state just doesn't, we just don't have that kind of money in the state budget. Like that's, you know, a $4 billion port, right? That's half the state water bond. I mean, that's a lot of dough. So, I mean, we'll see. We'll see where we end up with it. I think it's certainly worth studying, and then if the study comes back favorably, we can make the case that probably with the federal government that it's an important piece of infrastructure for the West Coast.
Jordan just basically said it all. We're going to try to have money for feasibility study and follow the facts where they take us.
The state water project will deliver no water to most communities in the coming year. Do you see this as the start of a zero state water trend?
Well, I had dinner Monday night with the state water director who gave me a preview of that. And, you know, it all depends on our boom and bust cycle on drought. And it took us to the 4th year of the last drought to get close to the 0%. And for those of you that don't understand it, the State Water Project provides water to water districts that serve 25 million individual Californians and to 3 million acres of irrigated agriculture. And historically, you go through the rainy season and you make announcements of what will be the allocation, and you start low and it gets higher and higher, and hopefully in April you get this high thing. And last year, for the first time in history, somewhere around March or April, they went backwards. That had never happened before, but we had so little rain in the end of the season that actually lowered the percent from the previous month. Starting out in the middle of the rainy season at 0% is pretty much unprecedented. And it's a nuanced 0%. There's a little water there for health and safety, like provide for hospitals and different things in certain ways. But if we don't have any measure of rain and it stays at 0%, that means particularly in the Central Valley, there'll be fallowing of parts of the agricultural industry, and there'll be, they're talking about the Metropolitan Water District in Southern California having a major suggested percentage reduction for all its users, and then you get into the wonky nuances, because if you're in LA City or to the east, you get Colorado River water or Owens Valley water and the State Water Project. If you're in Ventura County, you only get State Water Project water, and if it's 0%, that means there's nothing coming imported to Ventura County, and the others mix it. So it'll have all these disproportionate things in how it's applied, but it's just not good. It's really bad.
And another question that came in, we've seen a recent rise in commercial and retail theft. Retailers report many billions in loss due to theft. What can and should be done about that? And certainly we've seen that too in SLO County and Santa Barbara County over the last 2 weeks or so as well.
Yeah, I mean, the governor said something about it. I thought it was kind of humorous, actually, because it was like he announced that we need to crack down and hold people accountable for organized retail theft, and the picture behind him was like a Louis Vuitton store, which I thought was just hilarious. It's like, oh, wait, they're stealing rich people stuff. What, we can't let that happen? No, all joking aside, we have some quirks in the law where if you steal below a certain dollar amount, it's a misdemeanor only, and it's a side-out misdemeanor, meaning you don't get taken into custody. And some organized bands of no-good doers, or whatever you want to call them, have figured out how to exploit that and send different teams of people on a rotational basis in, and knowing that they're really, they're not going to get arrested, even if they get caught. They might not get caught. So it's a problem, and I think we need to look at the areas of law that are contributing to that. I think one of them was an unintended consequence of Prop 47, because it put the threshold for felony misdemeanor at $950 of value, which is interesting, because your average handgun is less than $950. I went to a conference once, and a guy told the story about a known gang member who was arrested in Riverside County, and he had a stolen gun on him. And the sheriffs had to cite him out, like, here, show up in court in 3 months. And he goes, well, you're not going to arrest me? I have a stolen gun on me. And they're like, well, we can't. And he goes, what a country. True story. So, there's some quirky stuff, and I think, if we got to give law enforcement and the prosecuting agencies the tools they need to do the job and hold people accountable that are doing it. I mean, it's organized crime, right? I mean, it's not the mafia, but it's organized crime. It's impacting people's business and their property and people's willingness to shop and the quality of the city and the downtown shopping experience, and it's doing that all over the state. So my suggestion would be to start with the Prop 47 thing, because I think that's something, now that's not necessarily an easy fix. I will say that, because it was enacted by initiative, which usually means it's a 2/3 vote to change it in the legislature. So,
Senator Laird, anything you want to add?
Well, yeah, both Jordan and I are sitting here looking directly at the DA.
Did you put that question in there?
And I've been trying to read his facial expressions during the answer to this question. He's smiling now. It's interesting, because whether it's voting or whether it's shoplifting, retail theft, it's phenomenal how much we rely on trust and self-policing. Because the incidence of voter fraud is so phenomenally low, but when people start to raise the issues, then the trust is lost in the system, even though that's still low. And I think we're facing the same thing here. People are making a calculation they can get away with this, and we have to decide what to do about it. And you're right. It's kind of like the recall laws. For a week or two after the recall, the poll numbers were phenomenal for people wanting reform, but getting a 2/3 vote and sending it to the voters will probably weaken anything that might be done. And so it's trying to navigate the desire to not have this happen with sort of the reality of what it takes to address it and see how we can get there.
And that was actually one of the questions, too, is in regards to the recall process. Should we reform it?
Yes, in my view. And as I said earlier, maybe about the time Jordan was born, I was working for the county administrator in Santa Cruz. Yeah, and that's probably true too. And we had 2 recalls, and it was a fascinating experience of county supervisors. And these 2 county supervisors each beat an opponent in 1 year, and then 18 months later, they got more votes to stay in office than the person got to succeed them. So the persons they beat 18 months before succeeded them and went back into office. And then when you could have a head-to-head race, 2 years later, one of them came back and unseated them again. And so what it means is there's this fundamental flaw that people can't run in their own race, or that people can get elected with less votes that keep them there. And the question is, what's the equitable way to address that? Either allowing everybody to run in a recall or allowing a runoff when that happens, something, but then you start to spin out into a level of complexity that then people are uncomfortable changing it. So is there some easy fix that we could get 2/3 vote for and the voters would go for?
And what do you think about the future of the 2-party system in California, starting today and 5 years from now?
Yeah, real quick on the recall. It's constitutional law in California, so you'd have to do it with an initiative presented to the voters. I could see an argument for raising the signature gathering threshold. That's maybe a start. It's 12.5% of the votes cast in the last election, I believe. Fact check me on that, but maybe that goes to 15% or something. I personally think you want a recall procedure. I mean, some weird stuff can happen. I mean, there have been state senators that have been convicted of arms trafficking while in office. I think you want to be able to recall that person, just my thought.
If they don't resign right away,
If
which
don't-
they did.
Which they didn't resign. Talk about brazen, yeah. It is, I am sympathetic to some of the points that it's kind of goofy the way we do it. I don't know. I think the appetite for really changing it will probably die down by the time we're back up there next year. And I don't know if California voters, even if they didn't vote to recall Newsom, I don't know. I'd have to see some polling to say where they're at on recalling the recall process. I don't know if, a lot of people probably want that option. Your question on the two-party system. Well, we still have two parties in California, for now. That's good news. I think everybody benefits in a democracy from more competitive balance. I think one thing that's made our federal system durable for all the frustration we all have at different times with but there's a check and balance there. I mean, every 2 years, it seems like the House, if not the Senate, is in play, and it forces some accountability to voters, and I think it's a good thing. The Republicans have had a rough go for a long time now in California. I think it started long before I was in office, but when I got elected in 2016, we had 27, I think. No, we had just had 28, and then my class was 25, Republicans out of 80. 2018, we lost 5 seats, and then Brian Mainshine switched parties, so we're down to 19. We're back up 1, I think. Or maybe we're at 19 still. So obviously, the supermajority is in place in both houses. So really, in terms of, it causes problems in some ways for the Democrats, which you can talk to, because your coalitions get so big that it gets hard to do things because you've got too many mouths to feed and too many people to keep happy to move stuff, right? But the one thing I tell people, and I don't want to get in a big civics lesson, but the governor in California is super powerful. It's different than the presidential federal system. There's line item veto in the budget. The governor introduces the budget in January or proposed one. There's a May revised budget. Very involved in the budget process. You got Emergency Services Act and executive powers. So a lot of our state governance kind of depends on the governor and what the governor ends up doing. So I don't see any feasible future where a Republican gets elected governor. I suspect it will happen in my lifetime in California. Things just sort of change and the coalitions change. And one thing that if you've been following kind of, you got election results up here, but underneath that, there are different shifting coalitions all the time. And there has been a realignment nationally that is starting to show up even here, where a lot of working class voters are actually gravitating more to Republicans, and a lot of upper income voters that used to be Republicans, like your classic, Orange County voter that's a doctor that has a BMW in the driveway would be a Republican 20 years ago probably, and they're not now, right? So there's a big realignment that's kind of happening underneath the surface, and it will take a long time for that to play out. So, but I think Republicans you want two parties, and that as much as people are shifting to register no party preference, that doesn't mean that you can viably have a third party of no party preference. The structural inherent advantages, there's a reason for 230 years in American elections, we've essentially had two parties. There's a lot of structural reasons for that. And as much as I would love to see a centrist third party, the efforts to get that off the ground have gone absolutely nowhere. And we can't even get a bill passed that would treat a potential third party the same in terms of campaign finance as the two major parties are treated. We're a long ways from getting any third party that's viable.
And you both
Just my
mentioned
view.
One of your top priorities includes the mitigating fire danger in California with the wildfires that we have experienced over the last couple of years. And so question comes in, what initiatives will be taken to work with indigenous nations within California to focus on fire reintroduction and cultural burning and land stewardship to mitigate fire intensity and prevent uncontrolled burns?
I really want to answer that question, but let me answer the previous question for a second here. Because when I was in the Assembly, it was 48 Democrats and 32 Republicans, and it has really morphed. And what it's done, just to accentuate what Jordan said, is then there's this broad coalition that it's hard to believe some of the people are in the same party, because we have business Dems and enviro Dems and social justice Dems and agricultural Dems. And so what you're really hoping for is that we're doing what everybody should be doing, which is working out our differences to the best of each interest within the party. And the Democratic Party will hold that big number if it can do that. And if it can't, it won't hold it. And I think, and I should add what you said, working people, because a lot of working people are feeling sort of left out economically, not that people are speaking to them. So it is a real challenge that way. And the question on fire, you know, it's interesting because when Europeans arrived in California, there were 300,000 people in California, and that's sort of what could sustainably survive without a dam or water system, could deal with sort of the burning to cleanse the forest and not worry that you got an urban interface and you're burning through a city while it's happening. And so those cultural practices really make sense, and there's something we should do. The problem is that the climate has changed, and it's, you know, I had the misfortune in my last 2 months of Resources Secretary, we had the Paradise Fire. And that fire burned at 60 acres a minute. It burned across a city of, you know, almost 30,000 people in an hour. And it's when the indigenous fires were being done, that kind of changed the climate, and that fertile, you know, combustion didn't exist. And so that's the problem. It's trying to mesh the practice that really is the right thing and works with the climate that we're in and the situation that we're facing. It's the CAL FIRE chief said when I was Resources Secretary, he said, we used to think that if we had a fire of 50,000 acres, that was the big fire of the season. And I think the last year we were there, we had 5 fires of 50,000 acres, and we weren't into June, or we were just into June. And that is a fundamental change in what's happening in the state.
Assemblyman Cunningham, anything to add?
No, I think that's a great answer.
And another question, we talked about homelessness earlier, and the question comes in, what is missing from our state approach to homelessness, and should currently or formerly unhoused people be part of that strategy?
And what was the last, I missed the last sentence.
Should current or formerly unhoused people be part of this strategy?
Yeah, I don't know about the last part, just because I'm not exactly sure what that means. But I'll give you my perspective of what I kind of see as missing. And this is admittedly going to be more of a description of the problem and not a solution, because homelessness is really complex. It's really, really tricky. When you spend some time in the legal system or in police work or with nonprofits that are out there doing that kind of work, I mean, you realize like we use a very broad label, homeless, to describe a lot of different circumstances that people are in. You know, some people are displaced temporarily from housing. That's a relatively easy thing to fix with resources. You find them housing, and you pay for that with public subsidy. Some people are mentally ill. Some people are mentally ill and on the streets unmedicated. And for various reasons, there's a lot of laws that makes it difficult to get them medication. Some people are homeless because of drug addiction. And I mean, my brother-in-law's in that circumstance back in Minnesota, and it's sad. And that's something where you can get them, and if you get them in the system and you can get them help, there's a chance that you can cure the problem. And then you got some people, and I don't think it's a big part of the population, but in the riverbed in Paso where I live, there's people that they're off the grid, man. They're cooking meth down in the river. They're living off the grid. They don't want your help, right? So we use this very broad thing to describe a very complex problem that has different solutions. If the issue's mental illness or the issue's drug addiction, it's a resources issue. It's connecting the people to the resources. If the issue's temporary housing, that's a resources issue. You can solve that by spending some money intelligently. And I think devolving as much of those dollars to the locals as possible because they know what works, right? The latter group is tough to deal with, and the mentally ill folks are tough to deal with in terms of solving that problem because it's not like you can go to somebody that is off their medication. I've represented these people in the legal system, and they end up getting picked up for battery or for this or that, and they end up in the jail. And then it's hard even to medicate them. But it's not like you can go to somebody that's off their medication and say, hey, Joe, will you take this? Oh, great. Joe goes, thanks a lot. And then now he's thinking correctly again, and now he's like, man, I don't want to be homeless. Like, can I do something about this? I mean, that's just not realistic. We also treat a lot of this, we put a lot on the backs of our police. I mean, and a 911 call or 5150 call, I mean, we're sending out law enforcement. They don't necessarily have the training to deal with that. I mean, why aren't we thinking about embedding in that or having people like a separate special 911 number that goes to people that have training in dealing with people that are having psychotic episodes? Like, I mean, cops aren't trained to do that, man. For the most part, they're trained to go out and investigate, separate people, make sure they're, and make an arrest if you got to make an arrest. They're not trained to assess whether somebody's schizophrenic and off their medication. So we're using our tools in entirely the wrong way in certain circumstances. And we're putting a lot on the backs of our law enforcement to do that. So that's more of a, just like I said, description of maybe the problems. The solutions would maybe be to try to figure out all the different ways that we can isolate this problem and not call it one thing and pretend that $7 billion in a budget's going to fix it. Because we've been spending money on homelessness the whole time I've been in the assembly, and it's been in every governor's speech, and the problem's only worse. So obviously we're not exactly solving it.
I know we're at the end of our time, so I subscribe to the notion that it's complex. And then would say the part of the question about whether unhoused people should pay a part, I'd say yes, because a lot of the things that Jordan was talking about, they have a better picture about what would work or what wouldn't work or what people should subscribe to. And I can't describe the number of times that people say, move them to state parks, move them to the fairgrounds. And it's like, but if you were talking to somebody that had formerly been homeless, I think they could explain what a lack of reality is contained in those comments and sort of talk about what it might take to break people out of the cycle.
And a lot of interesting points brought up. But just to wrap things up, if we could touch on, is there an issue or a bill that the Central Coast should keep an eye on moving forward, looking ahead to 2022?
I'd say keep an eye on the budget bill. Because actually almost every issue that we've talked about is going to be addressed in that. And the question of whether it's focused, whether there's accountability, whether it's not just saying we're doing this toward this problem, but how's it really affecting it? How's it going to be measured? And the other thing that I have to do a lot of the times, and I'm sure Jordan does, is, on fire, I got the first question when the governor's presented his budget in January, how will this get to the local agencies and what percentage will get locally? And it took him 3 weeks to tell me over 80%, but it's like, that's what we should be asking. And I think that's what everybody should be looking at. And I expect we would both want to hear from people what their judgment is about that.
Assemblyman Cunningham?
Yeah, I think the most accurate answer to that is probably the budget. I mean, because there's so much policy done in the budget now, too. I mean, we've seen bills that died on the floor, and somehow the language from the bills end up in the budget trailer bill or whatever. You're like, I thought that died. Like, what's going on? So it really is more policy making than ever in the process. In terms of solving these big picture, big ticket items, I mean, that's where the action's at. In terms of personal, I've taken on the cause of privacy, in particular children's privacy, against some of the sort of the, I guess you'd call them tech giants. It's been mostly getting my butt kicked, honestly, for about 3 years. But I think it's a righteous fight, and I think it's important because
Just for the record, he gets his butt kicked in the Assembly before it gets to the Senate.
yeah. I got one pending in Senate Judiciary. You're on that, right? So, smart speaker privacy bill that I've been working on for about 3 years. But we were able to, Governor Newsom did sign a bill I got to his desk this year that says you can't get consent from a minor by saying your parents' consent, right? Right, it ends the practice, puts it in the civil code that you have to have actual consent from a parent, which I hope will, if you look at the studies and graphs of the amount of time kids are spending on social media and the rise in teen depression and teen suicides, I'm not saying it's causation, but I'm saying if you look at those charts together, there's some scary correlation there. And I think that we've sort of unleashed, we're doing so much through screens and tablets, and it's fundamentally embedded in our education model now and all these things, and we're just sort of assuming that kids like have their brains are developed enough and they're not forming addictive patterns, and that this isn't bumming them out. Like when I went to school, like if you got bullied, it ended at 3 o'clock. Doesn't end anymore. Like follows them home. You know, people are doing it on Snapchat or all these other damn things. So TikTok. I've tried, me and my wife have tried unsuccessfully to ban TikTok in our house 4 times, by the way. It's harder than you think as a parent, and I'm somebody who's really concerned about this stuff, with your teenagers especially. So I think it's an important area of legislation that is in a very quickly evolving field that is impacting an entire generation. I think we need to do some more work carving out some space for kids to be at the proper level of maturity when they're using these devices and these types of apps.